The scent of aging paper and quiet dust was Olivia Blackwood's sanctuary, the only place where the crushing weight of her reality lifted, even for a moment. She moved with practiced grace between towering shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of forgotten tales in the hushed tranquility of the small-town library. At 24, she often felt far older, burdened by responsibilities that stretched beyond her years. Here, amidst the wisdom of centuries, she could almost pretend she was merely a visitor, passing through grand adventures instead of drowning in her own. Her quiet exterior, framed by soft brown hair often escaping its braid, belied a constant hum of anxiety within. Each late fee collected, each book reshelved, felt like a meager pebble against a mountain of debt. Student loans, relentless and unforgiving, had become a phantom limb, always there, aching. And then there was her grandmother. The medical bills piled higher than any stack of books Olivia had ever seen, each one a stark reminder of her beloved Nana's failing health and the desperate need for specialized care. The small, comfortable home they shared, a haven of mismatched furniture and shared memories, was perpetually at risk, teetering on the edge of foreclosure with every missed payment deadline. Just last week, another letter had arrived. A final notice, stark and unforgiving, for Nana's next round of treatments. Olivia had stared at it until the words blurred, the numbers mocking her meager librarian salary. She had scoured online job boards, applied for every imaginable second and third shift, but nothing was enough. Her heart ached with a longing for a different life, one where she belonged, truly belonged, instead of just visiting other people's stories. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, she would allow herself to dream, to imagine a hero stepping from the pages of a beloved romance, powerful and capable, sweeping away her worries with a single command. But then the cold light of dawn would break, and she would dismiss it as childish fantasy, a luxury she could not afford. There were no heroes in her real life, only bills and responsibilities. She was painstakingly repairing a tattered copy of Wuthering Heights when the sharp ring of the library's ancient landline startled her. It was a rare sound these days, most inquiries coming through email. Olivia answered, her voice a soft murmur of the library's name. "Olivia Blackwood?" a crisp professional voice inquired, startlingly sharp against the quiet. "This is Ms. Albright from Sterling and Finch. We're a high-profile executive search firm." Olivia's hand tightened on the fragile binding. A headhunter? For her? She was a small-town librarian, not some corporate titan. "We've been tasked with finding a candidate for a unique private collection in Seattle," Ms. Albright continued, oblivious to Olivia's shock. "The position is for a head librarian, managing a vast personal archive. The client is Mr. Dante Russo." The name hit Olivia like a physical blow. Dante Russo, the ruthless Seattle tech and shipping tycoon, whose name occasionally surfaced in the national news, always associated with power, wealth, and an almost intimidating aura of control. He was a force, a legend, utterly beyond her quiet world. The very idea of him, let alone working for him, felt impossibly out of reach, a cruel jest from a universe that usually ignored her pleas. "Mr. Russo is known for his exacting standards," Ms. Albright added, a hint of steel in her tone. "But the compensation package is, shall we say, unparalleled. We believe your unique qualifications, particularly your expertise in historical archives, make you a strong candidate." Olivia's breath hitched. Unparalleled compensation, the words echoed in her mind, a beacon cutting through the fog of her desperation. It was terrifying, ludicrous, a fantasy come to life in the most unexpected way, but it was also a lifeline, a desperate, impossible hope. She looked at the repair kit in her hands, then at the looming stack of bills in her mind. She might be out of her depth, out of her league, but she was out of options. For Nana, for their home, she had to try. The sleek, obsidian car, silent as a predator, deposited Olivia at the base of Dante Russo's corporate tower. It was a monolith of glass and steel, spearing the grey Seattle sky, a stark, gleaming challenge to the gentle brick of her small-town library. The air, crisp with the promise of rain, felt thinner here, colder. She clutched her worn briefcase, its contents, a carefully updated resume and a well-loved copy of Jane Eyre for comfort, feeling utterly inadequate. Every person who swept past her in the cavernous lobby seemed to possess an invisible armor of confidence she utterly lacked. A private elevator, all polished chrome and hushed luxury, whisked her upwards, the city shrinking below like a toy town. Her ears popped, her stomach fluttered with a nervous energy she couldn't quell. When the doors opened, she stepped into an office suite that stole her breath. It was minimalist, vast, and entirely composed of glass, overlooking the churning slate-grey waters of the bay. The sheer scale of it, the boundless vista, made her feel small, insignificant, yet acutely exposed. Dante Russo was already there, a dark, formidable silhouette against the panoramic view. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating an unshakable authority that permeated the very air. He didn't turn immediately, allowing her to absorb his presence, to feel the weight of his world. When he did, his eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept over her, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, dissecting her, knowing her. He was taller than she expected, broader in the shoulders, a man built for command, not for quiet contemplation in a library. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, resonant and deep, a sound that bypassed her ears and settled directly in her bones. "Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged, the words a statement, not a question. "Please, sit." She moved to the sleek leather chair he indicated, feeling clumsy, her movements too loud in the silent expanse. The interview began, not with the usual pleasantries, but with a rapid-fire series of questions about her experience, her methods, her dedication. Olivia, surprisingly, found her voice, speaking with passion about the quiet order of archives, the history held within pages, but even as she spoke, she felt the undercurrent of his scrutiny, a sense that he was looking beyond her words, into the very core of her being. Then her phone buzzed with an emergency text. It was from the nursing home, a critical update about Nana's latest medical setback, requiring an immediate, expensive decision. Her carefully constructed composure fractured. Her hands trembled, and a desperate, unbidden tear slipped down her cheek, betraying her. She tried to hide it, to discreetly dismiss the message, but Dante Russo missed nothing. His gaze sharpened, zeroing in on her vulnerability. He leaned forward, his elbows on the polished desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood. She requires specialized cardiac care and experimental treatment. The costs are substantial, far beyond what your current means can cover." Olivia gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. How could he possibly know? The information was deeply private, devastatingly personal. Her face burned with shame and a chilling fear. He hadn't been interviewing her for a librarian position at all. He had been investigating her. He didn't wait for her to respond. "The librarian position," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, "is no longer relevant." Her world tilted. Hope, fragile and desperate, crumbled. She stared at him, bewildered, the cold reality of her situation rushing back with full force. Then he pushed a thick, leather-bound folder across the vast expanse of the desk. It landed with a soft, authoritative thud. "My proposal is this, a contract of marriage. For the duration of my impending merger, you will be my wife. In return, all of your debts Every student loan, every medical bill for your grandmother will be erased. Her care will be permanently secured, the best money can buy." Olivia stared at the formidable document, then back at him. His face was unyielding, his expression impossible to read. A contract marriage. It was monstrous, unbelievable, the very stuff of her childish fantasies, twisted into a cold, corporate demand. Her mind reeled, grasping for objections, for an escape. But there was none. She saw Nana's frail face, the looming eviction notice. She saw the endless, suffocating cycle of debt. "It requires immediate acceptance," he added, his voice dropping an octave, a low, irresistible command. "Your signature and your life will be bound to mine. You will be under my protection, my authority. You will never want for anything again." His words, while terrifying in their implications, also held a strange, undeniable promise of safety. He was offering a fortress, an impregnable shield against the crushing anxieties that had defined her existence. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense will against her desperate vulnerability. Her breath hitched. There was no choice. Not really. She was a small bird caught in the storm, and he was the only shelter. With a trembling hand, she reached for the pen, ceding control of her immediate future to his demanding will, stepping into a cage of gold from which she knew, instinctively, there would be no easy escape. The sleek black car, the same one that had ferried her to Dante Russo's corporate monolith, now carried her away from the city's heart, climbing winding roads until it paused before an imposing gate. Beyond it, perched precariously on a cliff overlooking the churning grey waters of Puget Sound, was a mansion that seemed less like a home and more like a fortress. Walls of glass reflected the last sliver of twilight, blending with the mist that perpetually clung to the Seattle coastline. It was beautiful in a stark, intimidating way, a monument to unchecked power. Olivia stepped out, the crisp, salty air biting at her cheeks, and felt an immediate sense of being watched, not just by the silent, impeccably dressed man who held the car door open, but by unseen eyes, electronic and vigilant. The gate hissed open, then closed behind them with a heavy, final thud. Her new reality was beginning, and it felt like stepping into a cage of polished gold. Inside, the opulence was overwhelming. Soaring ceilings, acres of marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows that presented the vast, indifferent ocean as a living backdrop. It was utterly devoid of the warmth she associated with a home, feeling instead like a meticulously curated museum. A private elevator, activated by a silent scan, whisked them upward, sealing her in with a soft, mechanical sigh. Every aspect of this place screamed security, control, and an impenetrable barrier between Dante Russo and the rest of the world. And now, between Olivia Blackwood and everything she had ever known. Dante was waiting in what he called the main living area, a sprawling space that swallowed furniture whole. He stood by the panoramic window, his back to her, and the sheer size of him, even from a distance, was a palpable force. When he turned, his dark eyes met hers, assessing, unwavering. "You've seen the contract," he stated, his voice a low, steady current that vibrated through the expansive room. "Now you will understand its practical implications." He began to outline her new life, not with suggestions, but with commands. Security protocols were paramount: where she could go, who she could speak to, the importance of her security detail, which now consisted of 3 former military personnel, shadows in every corner of the mansion. Her public persona as his wife was to be maintained at all times, without question or deviation. Every gesture, every word, would be scrutinized. There would be no unauthorized contact with her grandmother, only scheduled video calls facilitated by his staff, ensuring her safety, and Olivia knew, ensuring his control. Her small-town librarian's heart reeled under the onslaught. Every aspect of her existence, from her movements to her identity, was now managed, curated, and dictated by him. She was an extension of his will, a piece on his chessboard. The sheer lack of personal autonomy was staggering, a suffocating blanket woven from silk and steel. She felt like a pawn in a game far too grand for her, a valuable object to be displayed, protected, and ultimately owned. Culture shock hit her with a physical force. The hushed efficiency of the staff, the intimidating silence of the vast rooms, the constant invisible presence of security. She often felt lost, a tiny, out-of-place figure navigating a landscape designed for giants. Yet even as the weight of his control pressed down, a strange, undeniable truth began to surface. His rules, as stringent and suffocating as they were, also provided an implicit safety. The locked elevator, the cameras, the watchful guards, they were a cage, yes, but they were also a shield. One evening, lost in the cavernous dining room, she had found herself staring at a meal she couldn't bring herself to touch. Dante, watching from the head of the impossibly long table, had simply said, "Eat. You need your strength." It was a command, not an invitation, but when she hesitantly began, she noticed his gaze linger, not in judgment, but in a silent, almost possessive expectation that she would obey, that she would be well. Another time, after a particularly draining day of being introduced to his formidable associates, she had felt a wave of exhaustion. He had merely pointed to a chaise lounge in her vast suite and said, "Rest, now." He hadn't asked, hadn't suggested, he had commanded, and as she sank into the plush cushions, a weariness she hadn't realized she was carrying finally giving way. A profound sense of protected peace settled over her. His control, absolute and unyielding, was also a form of intense, undeniable protection. It was a gilded cage, but she was slowly realizing it kept the monsters out, not just in. Daily life in Dante Russo's cliffside mansion quickly settled into a strange, opulent rhythm. Each morning began with the hushed efficiency of staff, the quiet clinking of porcelain, and the pervasive, almost invisible presence of security. Olivia moved through the vast, gleaming spaces, acutely aware of the cameras that dotted every corner, feeling both observed and protected. Forced proximity with Dante was simply a fact of her new existence. He was everywhere, his presence a gravitational pull she couldn't escape. She would see him during breakfast, a formidable figure at the head of the impossibly long dining table, his dark eyes scanning the financial reports spread before him. She would catch glimpses of him through the glass walls of his study, barking orders into a phone, his voice a low, commanding rumble that even at a distance conveyed absolute authority. Olivia watched him, fascinated and terrified. He moved with a predatory grace, his decisions swift and merciless, shaping empires with a single word. He was ruthless, undeniably, a man who bent the world to his will, and she was merely a small, fragile part of that world now. Yet, in those fleeting moments, she also saw a flicker of something else, a deep, unsettling intensity in his gaze that hinted at a complexity beyond the titan of industry. The true challenge, however, lay in the preparations for her public role. Dante was relentless, demanding. He considered their public appearances not mere social events, but strategic maneuvers in his high-stakes game. Every evening, after the last of his business calls concluded, she would be summoned. He would make her practice, sometimes for hours, standing before her with an exacting gaze. "Your posture, Olivia," he would instruct, his voice like rough velvet, "should convey confidence, not hesitation. Shoulders back, chin up, you are my wife. Act like it." He would demonstrate, his own frame a testament to controlled power, and she would try to mimic him, feeling clumsy and inadequate. He taught her how to smile, not a librarian's shy, polite curve of the lips, but a subtle, elegant tilt that implied understated grace. He instructed her on how to hold a champagne flute, how to make eye contact without lingering, how to deflect a probing question with a vague, pleasant answer. His corrections were precise, unwavering. Don't fidget. Maintain eye contact. Your hand here, lightly at my elbow. She would repeat the gestures until her muscles ached, until her face felt stiff from the forced expressions. The pressure was immense, a constant unspoken expectation that she would meet his formidable standards, that she would be the elegant, poised woman he needed her to be. Each session chipped away at her fragile composure, threatening to expose the quiet, overwhelmed woman beneath the carefully constructed facade. One particularly grueling evening, after nearly 2 hours of rehearsing her entrance into a fictitious charity gala, her resolve finally cracked. She had stumbled over a fabricated answer about their shared passions, her voice barely a whisper, her hands trembling. Dante had merely watched, his expression unreadable. When he finally dismissed her, saying only, "That is enough for tonight," Olivia felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion wash over her. She retreated to her vast, impersonal suite, the silence echoing her own inner turmoil. Sinking onto the edge of the bed, the weight of his expectations, the stark reality of her fake life became too much. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another, until her shoulders slumped and she buried her face in her hands, a quiet, desperate surrender. She wasn't sobbing, but the deep, aching weariness was palpable. A soft knock sounded at her door, unexpected and gentle. Before she could compose herself, it opened slightly, and a maid silently placed a delicate teacup and a small plate of shortbread on a nearby table. The tea, she noticed, was a specific blend of chamomile and lavender, her favorite, which she had only mentioned once, weeks ago, in passing. Dante's precise, demanding voice echoed in her mind. Rest. Now. She looked up, but the maid was already gone, the door softly closed. There was no chastisement, no lecture, only the warm, fragrant steam rising from the cup. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, yet it struck her with the force of a revelation. He hadn't demanded she be stronger, or told her to pull herself together. He had simply ensured she had what she needed, quietly, efficiently. His control extended not just to her public performance, but to her well-being, her comfort, even her quiet moments of vulnerability. She lifted the teacup, its warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. The strange, unfamiliar comfort that settled over her was potent, addictive. It was terrifying, this absolute surrender to his will, this ceding of her every need to a man so powerful, so dominant. But in that moment, as she sipped the soothing tea, she also realized that his demanding authority, while suffocating, also cradled her. He was a force of nature, yes, but he was her force of nature, and under his formidable shadow she found a peculiar, undeniable sense of safety. Around her neck, nestled beneath her silk nightgown, the cool weight of the diamond ring on its delicate platinum chain was a constant presence. It was his claim, a public declaration of ownership that, despite its terrifying implications, promised an ironclad protection. It was the mark of a monster, perhaps, but a monster whose formidable strength was now entirely devoted to her. The night of their first major public appearance as husband and wife arrived with the relentless grey drizzle typical of Seattle. Yet inside Dante Russo's mansion, a different storm brewed. Olivia stood before the full-length mirror in her suite, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The gown, a sheath of deep sapphire silk, clung to her curves with an elegance she hadn't known she possessed. Her hair, usually a simple braid, was swept into a sophisticated chignon, and jewels, cool and heavy against her skin, glittered at her throat and ears. She looked stunning, undeniably, But beneath the veneer of expensive silk and diamonds, she felt utterly fraudulent, a shy librarian playing a role she was profoundly unsuited for. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She was out of her depth, out of her league, a fragile vessel about to be launched into a sea of sharks. Every lesson Dante had drilled into her, the posture, the smile, the art of deflection, felt flimsy, ready to crumble under the intense scrutiny she knew awaited them. She smoothed the silk over her trembling hands, wishing for the familiar comfort of worn denim and the hushed sanctuary of her library. Dante entered the suite without a knock, his presence a sudden, commanding force that filled the vast space. He wore a tuxedo, impeccably tailored, making him look even taller, broader, a dark, formidable silhouette against the softer light of the room. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over her, a slow, possessive appraisal that left her breathless. "Ready, Olivia?" His voice was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was not a question, but a command, an expectation she dared not defy. She simply nodded, unable to find her voice. He offered his arm, and as her fingers brushed the expensive fabric of his sleeve, a jolt went through her. His skin felt warm, solid, an anchor in the swirling anxiety. Stepping out of the car at the gala venue was like walking into a blinding flash. A cacophony of camera clicks. The roar of the crowd and the low hum of excited whispers assaulted her senses. She instinctively flinched, her hand tightening on Dante's arm, but his grip on her back was immediate, firm, a silent reassurance. He guided her forward, his pace unhurried, a wall of unyielding composure against the chaos. His hand settled at the small of her back, a constant, possessive pressure that both terrified and calmed her. It was a subtle gesture, yet it spoke volumes, marking her as his. A declaration to anyone who dared to look. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, the polite but sharp judgments of Seattle society sizing her up, dissecting her. Whispers followed them like shadows. The new wife, the librarian, the one who came out of nowhere. The pressure was immense, a silent assault threatening to crack her composed exterior. She felt every nerve ending screaming, every practiced smile feeling like a grotesque mask. But Dante was a fortress. He moved through the glittering throng, a dominant force, his head held high, his gaze missing nothing. When a particularly aggressive reporter tried to push through, Dante merely shifted, his sheer physical presence enough to deflect the man without a single word. When a rival investor, a man whose smile held the sharpness of a knife, attempted a probing question about her background, Dante's grip on her back tightened imperceptibly. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "My wife finds such inquiries tiresome. We are here to celebrate, Mr. Thorne, not to conduct a background check." The dismissal was ice-cold, final. Olivia felt a strange, potent comfort in his ruthlessness. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster. She was merely a pawn, but a fiercely guarded pawn, shielded by an impenetrable wall of possessive authority. She felt his strength, his absolute control, and in it she found her own. She began to yield to his subtle cues, the slight pressure on her back guiding her turn, the almost imperceptible squeeze of his hand instructing her to smile, to nod, to simply exist as his elegant accessory. Each time he deflected a question, each time he subtly positioned himself between her and a curious gaze, a profound sense of security settled over her. It was terrifying, this ceding of all autonomy, this complete reliance on his formidable will, but it was also undeniably safe. She was not just playing his wife, she was under his ironclad protection, a precious possession in a world far too dangerous for her to navigate alone. As the evening wore on, the initial panic began to ebb, replaced by a strange, almost addictive peace. He was her shield, her strength, and in his demanding presence she found a burgeoning sense of power, knowing that as long as she remained by his side, under his command, no harm could touch her. The diamond ring, hidden on its chain beneath her gown, felt less like a symbol of a contract and more like a promise. The high-stakes world of Dante Russo was a constant, thrumming undercurrent in Olivia's new life, a powerful tide that pulled at the edges of her carefully constructed composure. The merger deal, which had initially seemed like a distant, abstract concept, now felt like a living, breathing entity, growing more volatile with each passing day. She saw it reflected in Dante's intensified schedule, in the grim set of his jaw as he watched financial news broadcasts, and in the hushed, urgent tones of his phone calls that sometimes carried through the thick doors of his study. Rival investors, names that meant nothing to her but everything to him, were whispered in the periphery, becoming the unseen antagonists in this dangerous game. Their presence was palpable, a chilling awareness that the world outside the mansion's fortified walls was growing increasingly hostile. Olivia, though shielded by Dante's imposing presence, couldn't help but absorb the tension. She found herself subconsciously checking the locks on her suite door, her gaze lingering a moment too long on the security cameras that dotted the mansion's opulent corridors. A creeping unease began to settle in her bones, a primal instinct that whispered of unseen eyes, even within the fortress. It was a subtle shift, a shadow lengthening in her peripheral vision, making the vast, glittering mansion feel less like a sanctuary and more like a very exposed stage. One morning, as she waited in the antechamber of Dante's study, she overheard a fragment of a conversation. Dante's voice, usually a deep, controlled rumble, was edged with a cold fury she hadn't heard before. Untraceable, mentioned her by name, a clear message. The words were clipped, sharp, aimed at his head of security. Olivia's blood ran cold. Her name. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a horrifying realization that the abstract danger of the merger was suddenly, terrifyingly personal. Her heart hammered, a frantic beat against her ribs. She was not just an accessory, she was a target. Later that week, as she was being escorted to the kitchen for a rare moment of choosing her own tea, she passed one of the security monitors. The guard, a stern-faced man named Marcus, was scrolling through footage of the mansion's main gates. For a fleeting second, before Marcus swiftly changed the screen, Olivia caught a glimpse of a face. It was indistinct, blurred by distance and the rain. But something about it, a certain angle of the jaw, the way the man held himself, struck her as eerily familiar. She couldn't place it, and the image was gone before she could fully process it, leaving behind only a persistent prickle of recognition, a chilling sense of having seen that face somewhere, sometime before. She didn't dare ask, but the incident deepened her apprehension, confirming the insidious feeling that the world was pressing in, trying to find a weak point. Dante's demeanor, already formidable, hardened noticeably in the days that followed. His jaw was perpetually clenched. His eyes, when they met hers, were like chips of dark ice. The slight, almost imperceptible softening he sometimes allowed himself in her presence vanished, replaced by an even more intense focus, a palpable aura of vigilance. He began to move with a coiled tension, like a predator sensing a threat. The mansion, already a bastion of security, became an impenetrable fortress. More guards appeared, their presence a silent, constant reminder of the escalating danger. New protocols were implemented. No one entered or left without Dante's direct approval. Even staff. The private elevator, already her only ingress and egress, now required a double authentication. Her movements, already restricted, became even more so. She was rarely out of sight of at least 2 security personnel, even when simply walking from her suite to the living area. The gilded cage, she realized, was tightening its bars. One evening, after she accidentally left a window in her suite slightly ajar, a small, innocent oversight from her old life, Dante appeared in the doorway, his presence an almost physical shock. His eyes, dark as a winter storm, swept over the open pane, then fixed on her. His voice was a low, dangerous growl, devoid of any warmth. "Olivia," he began, his tone a command that brooked no argument. "My rules are not suggestions. They are absolute. Every protocol, every instruction is for your protection. Do you understand?" She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense will against her desperate vulnerability. The air crackled with his controlled fury, and in it she sensed the immense weight of his responsibility for her. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, making her feel small, exposed. The consequences of disobedience, of carelessness, are not merely inconvenient. They are potentially fatal. For you. His gaze intensified, boring into her, demanding not just understanding, but complete, unwavering compliance. "Your absolute adherence to my rules is paramount. It is the only way you remain safe. Do I make myself clear?" She nodded, unable to speak, her breath catching in her throat. His words, though terrifying in their brutal honesty, resonated with a chilling truth. She was his entirely, and her safety was inextricably linked to her submission. In that moment, surrounded by his formidable presence, her fear of the external threat mingled with a strange, undeniable comfort in his absolute authority. His glare, direct and unyielding, was a silent declaration. Her survival depended entirely on him, on her trust in his ruthless protection, and on her unwavering obedience to his every command. She had no choice but to rely entirely on him, to cede every last scrap of autonomy, knowing that in his formidable strength she would find her only sanctuary. Olivia was in the sunroom, attempting to lose herself in a particularly dense historical text from Dante's collection, when the mansion's usual hum of quiet efficiency shattered. Not with a bang, but with a sudden, jarring change in frequency, a high-pitched, insistent electronic whine that pulsed through the very foundations of the house. It was a sound she hadn't heard before, sharp and alarming, signaling a breach. Her book clattered to the floor, forgotten. The glass walls of the sunroom, usually a serene portal to the stormy bay, now felt like a terrifyingly thin barrier. She scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. The quiet librarian's world she had built around herself in this gilded cage suddenly, violently ripped apart. She knew, instinctively, this was not a drill. This was the threat they had been whispering about, and it felt like it was clawing at the very windows. She rushed towards the main living area, drawn by the frantic shouts of security personnel echoing from the perimeter. Through one of the large monitors embedded in the wall, usually displaying abstract art, she saw it, a delivery van, nondescript and ordinary, stalled at the outermost gate. But it wasn't the van that held her frozen in terror. It was the package, innocuous-looking, that had been left precisely at the threshold, triggering the immediate piercing alarm. One of Dante's ex-military guards, moving with a speed that blurred, was already there, his weapon drawn, his body tense. Before she could even process the image, a controlled explosion, muffled but still rattling the glass around her, erupted from the package. It wasn't meant to kill, she realized with a sickening lurch, but to send a message, a clear, chilling message. The incident, though quickly contained by Dante's swift-moving security team, confirmed her deepest fears. The danger was real, and it was aimed directly at her. Her quiet world, already precarious, now lay in shards around her. She was terrified, a small bird caught in a storm far beyond her comprehension. She felt utterly exposed, the fortress she had come to rely on suddenly porous, vulnerable. Dante appeared in the archway of the living area, his presence a dark, formidable force against the backdrop of agitated guards. His face, usually a mask of control, was now a rigid canvas of cold fury. His jaw was clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek, and his eyes, usually so piercing, held a dangerous, chilling intensity. He wasn't shouting, but his voice, when he spoke to his head of security, was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the marble floors. "Sweep the perimeter, identify the vector. I want every inch of the outer wall rescanned. And I want that driver found." His commands were sharp, precise, each word a hammer blow. The security team, a dozen ex-military shadows, moved with a terrifying efficiency, each man a silent extension of Dante's will. They melted away, leaving Olivia alone with him in the vast, tense silence. He turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her trembling form, assessing, measuring. She felt small, fragile, utterly at his mercy. He walked towards her, each step deliberate, powerful, until he stood directly before her, eclipsing the light from the windows. The sheer size of him, his broad shoulders and formidable height, pressed down on her, making her feel even more insignificant. "This," he began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that bypassed her ears and settled directly in her bones, "is why my rules are absolute, Olivia. This is why you trust me, why you obey me." He reached out, his large hand brushing her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and oddly comforting despite its chilling context. His thumb stroked her skin, a slow, deliberate movement that held her captive. "They want to find your weakness. They want to use you, but they will not touch you." His voice hardened, a steel edge to his words that promised retribution on an unimaginable scale. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let a single hair on your head be harmed." Olivia could only stare up at him, breathless. The raw, terrifying intensity of his protection was overwhelming. His fury, once directed at the unseen enemy, now seemed to envelop her, a fierce, primal claim. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense, ruthless will against her desperate vulnerability. Her quiet world had been shattered, yes, but in its place he was offering an even more impenetrable fortress, himself. "Your life," he reiterated, his eyes boring into hers, demanding complete, unwavering submission, "depends on trusting me completely, on following my every command, without question, without hesitation. Do you understand?" Her throat was tight, her voice gone. She could only nod, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had no choice, not really. The terror of the outside world, the real, tangible threat that had just breached his formidable defenses, made her realize with stunning clarity that her only sanctuary, her only hope of survival, was in his absolute, unwavering protection. She was utterly reliant on him, a silent, trembling acceptance of her fate. In his terrifying command, in his cold, unwavering fury, she found a strange, undeniable sense of safety, knowing that he would stop at nothing to keep her his own. The air in the opulent conference room was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable hum that vibrated beneath Olivia's skin. She sat beside Dante, a silent, elegant fixture in a world of sharp suits and even sharper minds. This wasn't a social gala, but a closed-door meeting of corporate titans, a strategic gathering where alliances were forged and enemies subtly threatened. Rival investors, men whose names she now recognized from the news, were present, their gazes like calculating instruments, sweeping over Dante, then inevitably over her. She felt their scrutiny, a chilling awareness of being appraised, measured as if she were another asset on a balance sheet. Dante, however, remained an unshakable monolith of power at the head of the polished mahogany table. He spoke with a cool, authoritative calm, dissecting numbers and strategies with ruthless precision. Olivia watched him, mesmerized by the sheer force of his will, the way he commanded the room without raising his voice, every word a definitive statement. He was a predator in his natural habitat, and she, a quiet observer, felt a visceral understanding of why he was so feared. But the real purpose of her presence, she slowly realized, was not just to display a stable image. It was to be a living, breathing declaration. During a brief lull in the proceedings, as a particularly aggressive rival, a man named Sterling attempted to challenge one of Dante's proposals. Dante shifted. His hand, warm and heavy, settled on the back of Olivia's chair. A subtle, possessive claim that sent a shiver through her. He didn't look at her. His dark eyes remained fixed on Sterling, but the gesture was unmistakable. "Gentlemen!" Dante's voice cut through the slight ripple of conversation, deeper now, with an edge of steel that made the room fall silent. "Before we continue, I want to make one thing unequivocally clear." His gaze swept across the faces of the rival investors, each man feeling the weight of his unspoken warning. "My interests in this merger and in my personal life are now inextricably linked. Any attempts to destabilize either will be met with extreme prejudice." His eyes, dark and piercing, then briefly flickered to Olivia, a possessive flash that solidified his words. He was talking about her. He was talking about the incident at the gate, the veiled threats. He was, in his own terrifying way, declaring her off-limits. His hand on her chair tightened almost imperceptibly, a silent emphasis. Olivia felt the impact of his declaration like a physical blow. The air around them crackled with his raw, unyielding dominance. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't explicitly threatened anyone, but the message was clear, chilling in its implication. "She is mine. Touch her, and you will face my wrath." The "touch her and die" element, as she had instinctively labeled it, was firmly established, a terrifying promise whispered in the quiet menace of his tone. A cold fear snaked through her, witnessing the brutal ownership displayed so openly. He wasn't just protecting her, he was claiming her, marking her as his territory in the most primal, absolute way. It was terrifying, the sheer scale of his power, the lengths he would go to protect what he considered his. She was not just a fake wife, she was a prized possession, and he would burn worlds to keep her safe. Yet despite the tremor in her hands, despite the cold knot of dread in her stomach, a strange, profound sense of safety began to bloom within her. It was a dark, dangerous comfort, an intoxicating blend of fear and relief. The world outside, the world of mercenaries and anonymous threats, felt distant, unable to penetrate the formidable wall that was Dante. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster. And his formidable strength was now entirely devoted to her. She looked at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the unyielding set of his mouth. He was her shield, her fortress. And in that moment, she understood with crystalline clarity that her survival, her very peace, depended on yielding to his will. The terrifying power difference between them, his ruthless command and her quiet vulnerability, was no longer a source of agonizing internal conflict. It was simply a fact, an undeniable truth. She began to trust his authority implicitly, understanding that her very existence now depended on it. She was claimed utterly and irrevocably, and in that absolute surrender she found a strange, compelling freedom from fear. The conflict with Dante's rivals, once a distant hum of danger, now felt like a storm raging just beyond the mansion's glass walls, its fury pressing in on Olivia's carefully curated existence. The high-stakes merger deal became the air she breathed, thick with tension and the unspoken threat of violence. Her days, once spent in the quiet rhythm of the library, were now confined to the gilded cage of Dante's world, her every movement dictated by his absolute control. The first direct attempt to reach her, a carefully crafted email sent to her old library address, almost slipped past his formidable defenses. It purported to be from a former colleague, filled with nostalgic anecdotes and a seemingly innocent invitation to a coffee shop in her hometown. But Dante's security, unseen and omnipresent, intercepted it. He showed her the email himself, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he explained the sophisticated phishing attempt. The sender's IP address had been traced to a ghost server, a digital fingerprint of his rivals. Olivia's blood ran cold. They were trying to lure her out, to exploit her past, to make her vulnerable. Then came the calls to her grandmother's care facility. Not direct threats, but subtle inquiries, veiled attempts to gain information about Nana's schedule, her visitors, her fragile health. The facility, now funded entirely by Dante's seemingly bottomless resources, was already a fortress. Yet the audacity of the rivals, their willingness to poke at her deepest vulnerability, left Olivia trembling. She saw Dante's face harden, a cold, ruthless resolve settling in his eyes. His control, already absolute, became a suffocating blanket woven from steel. Her phone, once a lifeline to her quiet past, was now a monitored device, its calls screened, its messages filtered. Her infrequent video calls with Nana were facilitated by his staff, ensuring no coded messages or hidden pleas could be exchanged. Her outside connections were severed, one by one, for her safety. The isolation was intense, a heavy weight that pressed down on her spirit. She often found herself staring out at the stormy Seattle skyline, longing for the simple familiarity of her old life, for the freedom to walk unescorted, to choose her own path. But then, the chilling reality of the alternative would settle in. The memory of the explosion at the gate, the thought of Nana's delicate health, the ruthless calculations of Dante's enemies. The isolation, as suffocating as it was unthinkable. It was the price of her protection. Dante, in these days of escalating threats, was a force of nature, primal and unyielding. She saw him in his study, late into the night, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he issued orders. She saw the new faces among the security detail, hardened men who moved like shadows, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. She didn't see the details of his retaliation, but she felt its impact. The subtle disappearances of threats, the sudden silence from certain quarters. The air around them, though still tense, seemed to clear, as if obstacles were being systematically, ruthlessly removed. One evening, after a particularly long day confined to the mansion, a day filled with the unspoken fear of what the rivals might attempt next, Olivia found Dante in the vast living area. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the rain-lashed bay. She approached him cautiously, feeling the immense gravity of his presence. "They tried to access your old bank accounts," he stated, not turning, his voice a low, chilling monotone. "To follow the money trail, to find leverage." Olivia gasped, clutching her arms to herself. How far did his reach extend? How much of her past had he already claimed, protected, secured? He finally turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and unwavering. They failed. Every thread they tried to pull, every door they tried to open was already locked or cut. His gaze was possessive, almost predatory. "You are mine, Olivia. You are under my protection. No one touches what is mine." His words were a stark, brutal declaration of ownership, terrifying in their implication, yet strangely, profoundly comforting. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense, unwavering will against her desperate vulnerability. He wasn't just protecting her. He was ruthlessly eliminating any outside threats that dared to come too close, solidifying her status as his most valuable possession. In his fierce, unyielding gaze, in the absolute control he exerted over every aspect of her life, Olivia found a strange, compelling peace. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and his formidable strength was entirely devoted to her. The gilded cage was tightening, and the isolation was a heavy burden, but the alternative was a terrifying abyss. She was his, utterly and irrevocably, a fiercely protected anchor in his ruthless world, and in that complete surrender she found her only true sanctuary. The conflict with Dante's rivals, once a distant hum of danger, now felt like a storm raging just beyond the mansion's glass walls, its fury pressing in on Olivia's carefully curated existence. The high-stakes merger deal became the air she breathed, thick with tension and the unspoken threat of violence. Her days, once spent in the quiet rhythm of the library, were now confined to the gilded cage of Dante's world, her every movement dictated by his absolute control. The first direct attempt to reach her, a carefully crafted email sent to her old library address, almost slipped past his formidable defenses. It purported to be from a former colleague, filled with nostalgic anecdotes and a seemingly innocent invitation to a coffee shop in her hometown. But Dante's security, unseen and omnipresent, intercepted it. He showed her the email himself, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he explained the sophisticated phishing attempt. The sender's IP address had been traced to a ghost server, a digital fingerprint of his rivals. Olivia's blood ran cold. They were trying to lure her out, to exploit her past, to make her vulnerable. Then came the calls to her grandmother's care facility. Not direct threats, but subtle inquiries, veiled attempts to gain information about Nana's schedule, her visitors, her fragile health. The facility, now funded entirely by Dante's seemingly bottomless resources, was already a fortress. Yet the audacity of the rivals, their willingness to poke at her deepest vulnerability, left Olivia trembling. She saw Dante's face harden, a cold, ruthless resolve settling in his eyes. His control, already absolute, became a suffocating blanket woven from steel. Her phone, once a lifeline to her quiet past, was now a monitored device, its calls screened, its messages filtered. Her infrequent video calls with Nana were facilitated by his staff, ensuring no coded messages or hidden pleas could be exchanged. Her outside connections were severed, one by one, for her safety. The isolation was intense, a heavy weight that pressed down on her spirit. She often found herself staring out at the stormy Seattle skyline, longing for the simple familiarity of her old life, for the freedom to walk unescorted, to choose her own path. But then the chilling reality of the alternative would settle in. The memory of the explosion at the gate, the thought of Nana's delicate health, the ruthless calculations of Dante's enemies. The isolation, as suffocating as it was unthinkable. It was the price of her protection. Dante, in these days of escalating threats, was a force of nature, primal and unyielding. She saw him in his study, late into the night, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he issued orders. She saw the new faces among the security detail, hardened men who moved like shadows, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. She didn't see the details of his retaliation, but she felt its impact. The subtle disappearances of threats, the sudden silence from certain quarters. The air around them, though still tense, seemed to clear, as if obstacles were being systematically, ruthlessly removed. One evening, after a particularly long day confined to the mansion, a day filled with the unspoken fear of what the rivals might attempt next, Olivia found Dante in the vast living area. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the rain-lashed bay. She approached him cautiously, feeling the immense gravity of his presence. "They tried to access your old bank accounts," he stated, not turning, his voice a low, chilling monotone. "To follow the money trail, to find leverage." Olivia gasped, clutching her arms to herself. How far did his reach extend? How much of her past had he already claimed, protected, secured? He finally turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and unwavering. They failed. Every thread they tried to pull, every door they tried to open, was already locked or cut. His gaze was possessive, almost predatory. "You are mine, Olivia. You are under my protection. No one touches what is mine." His words were a stark, brutal declaration of ownership, terrifying in their implication, yet strangely, profoundly comforting. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense, unwavering will against her desperate vulnerability. He wasn't just protecting her. He was ruthlessly eliminating any outside threats that dared to come too close, solidifying her status as his most valuable possession. In his fierce, unyielding gaze, in the absolute control he exerted over every aspect of her life, Olivia found a strange, compelling peace. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and his formidable strength was entirely devoted to her. The gilded cage was tightening, and the isolation was a heavy burden, but the alternative was a terrifying abyss. She was his, utterly and irrevocably, a fiercely protected anchor in his ruthless world, and in that complete surrender she found her only true sanctuary. The days bled into weeks, each one a stark reminder of her gilded isolation. Olivia found herself increasingly withdrawn, the quiet librarian within, yearning for a sliver of her former autonomy, a space where Dante's formidable will didn't entirely dictate her existence. The mansion, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic views, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully constructed prison. She was safe, yes, but at what cost? The leather-bound marriage contract, a symbol of her forced surrender, lay in a locked drawer in her suite, a constant nagging presence. She rarely looked at it, the memories of that desperate day too painful. But the escalating threats, the tightening grip of Dante's control, stirred a new, unsettling curiosity within her. She needed to understand the terms of her captivity, to trace the precise boundaries of her new life. One rainy afternoon, feeling particularly small and insignificant, she retrieved the document, its pages rustling softly as she opened it on the vast, polished desk. She spent hours poring over the dense legal text, her librarian's instinct for detail kicking in. Most of it was boilerplate, confirming the public duties, the financial provisions, the ironclad clauses that bound her to Dante. Her initial fear had been so overwhelming that she hadn't truly processed the intricacies, only the terrifying bottom line. Now, with a calmer, if still heavy heart, she searched for loopholes, for any clause that might offer a glimmer of independence, a path, however faint, back to her own life. She found nothing. The contract was a masterpiece of legal entrapment, meticulously crafted. Just as she was about to give up, her eyes scanning the final addendums, a specific clause, buried deep within the fine print, caught her attention. It was couched in complex legal jargon, almost designed to be overlooked, but the keywords jumped out at her. All outstanding personal debts, including but not limited to educational loans, incurred by Olivia Blackwood prior to the date of this agreement, shall be deemed satisfied through direct purchase by Dante Russo Holdings, LLC, effective 6 months prior to the date of formal proposal. Olivia's breath hitched, her blood ran cold. She reread the words, her mind struggling to comprehend, 6 months prior to the date of formal proposal. He hadn't just paid off her student loans as part of the contract, he had purchased them and effectively nullified them before he even offered her the deal. Long before he had ever sat her down in his intimidating office and presented her with the shocking proposal, he had already woven her into his web. The realization was a profound shock, shaking her understanding of their entire initial agreement. It wasn't a desperate solution to her immediate crisis. It was a premeditated act, a meticulously planned maneuver. He hadn't merely offered her a way out of her debt. He had ensured her debt was already under his control, making her utterly reliant on him before she even knew his name. The thought sent a chill spiraling through her veins, a horrifying blend of gratitude and terror. Why would he do that? Why such a calculated long-term entanglement? Her initial relief, the potent comfort she had found in his protection, curdled into a disquieting unease. The safety he offered was not merely a shield, it was a cage built long before she stepped inside. Its bars forged from her own desperate circumstances. She felt a suffocating sense of being manipulated, of having her life orchestrated by a force she couldn't possibly resist. This discovery made escape far more difficult than she had ever imagined, further entangling her in his web. The idea that he'd set this up so meticulously, so far in advance, wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. It spoke of an obsession, a level of control that went far beyond a simple business arrangement. She wasn't just his fake wife, she was a prized acquisition, carefully selected, meticulously ensnared. The gilded cage now felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a permanent, inescapable claim. The days bled into weeks, each one a stark reminder of her gilded isolation. Olivia found herself increasingly withdrawn, the quiet librarian within yearning for a sliver of her former autonomy, a space where Dante's formidable will didn't entirely dictate her existence. The mansion, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic views, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully constructed prison. She was safe, yes, but at what cost? The discovery of the hidden clause, the revelation that Dante had not just paid her debts, but had purchased them months before their contract, had left her reeling. It was a profound shock, shaking her understanding of their entire initial agreement. She felt manipulated, ensnared, and a desperate need for clarity, for someone to explain the cold logic of such a long-term, calculated trap. The only person she felt a sliver of comfort with, a temporary reprieve from Dante's omnipresent intensity, was Thomas, his cousin and the family lawyer. Thomas was younger than Dante, with a softer demeanor, a ready smile, and eyes that seemed to hold a genuine, if sometimes hesitant, empathy. He had handled some of the initial paperwork for her grandmother's care, and in their brief interactions he had always seemed approachable, a small island of normalcy in Dante's formidable world. She needed to talk to him, to seek guidance, to try and understand the intricate legal web Dante had woven around her. With a trembling hand, Olivia sent a discreet message to Thomas, requesting a private meeting. He responded quickly, suggesting his office in the corporate tower, a place she now navigated with a sense of guarded familiarity. She arrived, escorted by her usual 2 security shadows, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and a fragile hope. Thomas was already waiting, his office a slightly less imposing version of Dante's, though still boasting floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He rose, his smile warm and seemingly sincere. "Olivia, please come in. You look, well, considering everything." His gaze held a concern that momentarily eased her tension. She sat, clutching her hands in her lap. "Thomas, I need to ask you about the contract, about the clauses regarding my student loans." She watched him carefully, searching for any flicker of surprise. He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Ah, yes, a rather unique arrangement, wasn't it? Dante is nothing if not thorough." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a sympathetic murmur. "It must have been quite a shock to have all that debt suddenly lifted. And your grandmother Eleanor, I believe. Her care at Golden Shores is exceptional, isn't it? Dante made sure of that. Only the best for family, even extended family, as you are now." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Golden Shores. Dante had never mentioned the specific facility to her, only that Nana's care was secured. How did Thomas know the name? And the casual mention of her grandmother's first name, her full name, felt too intimate, too familiar for mere professional courtesy. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. "Are you truly happy, Olivia?" Thomas continued, his voice laced with what sounded like genuine concern. "Dante can be intense. Does he give you enough freedom? Are you comfortable with the security arrangements? It must be hard, not being able to visit your grandmother whenever you want, even with Dante covering all her expenses." His questions, seemingly empathetic, were like subtle probes, each one digging for a weakness, an area of discontent. He was fishing, she realized with a sickening lurch, not for her well-being, but for information. The empathy in Thomas's eyes suddenly felt like a lie, a carefully constructed facade. He knew too much, asked too many pointed questions. He wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to extract something from her. Her mind reeled, connecting the dots, the rivals, the threats, the constant search for leverage. He wasn't her confidant. He was a conduit, a traitor. Just as the horrifying realization solidified, the heavy oak door to Thomas's office swung open without a knock. Dante stood in the doorway, a formidable silhouette, his presence a sudden commanding force that sucked all the air from the room. His dark eyes swept over Olivia, then fixed on Thomas, cold and unyielding. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a grim, chilling certainty. Thomas paled, his practiced smile vanishing, replaced by a look of stark terror. He stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Dante, what are you doing here? Olivia and I were just discussing—" Dante cut him off, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that bypassed her ears and settled directly in her bones. "Thomas, your services are no longer required. Effective, immediately." His gaze was absolute, brooking no argument. "My security has already escorted your personal effects from the premises. You'll find your final severance in your account. Do not return." Thomas opened his mouth, a desperate protest forming. But Dante merely raised a hand, a gesture of dismissal so final, so utterly devoid of mercy, that Thomas simply closed his mouth, shrinking under his cousin's terrifying gaze. He looked at Olivia, his eyes wide with a desperate, unspoken plea. But she could only stare, breathless and numb. Dante didn't waste another second on him. He turned his full attention to Olivia, his formidable presence eclipsing everything else. "Are you all right?" His voice was low, but his eyes, dark and piercing, burned with a furious intensity. Olivia could only nod, her throat tight, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The fear of Thomas, the chilling realization of his betrayal, was swiftly replaced by a deeper, more complex terror of Dante himself. He had known. He had suspected his own cousin, had allowed Olivia to walk into this trap, orchestrating her discovery, reinforcing his own absolute control and chilling foresight. He was always 10 steps ahead, always anticipating, always planning. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek in a gesture that was both possessive and oddly comforting. "No one touches what is mine, Olivia. No one betrays what I protect." His words were a silent promise of ruthless retribution, a chilling testament to his unyielding power. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense, unwavering will against her profound vulnerability. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and in his cold, absolute control, in his terrifying ruthlessness, she found a strange, undeniable sense of safety. He would burn worlds for her, and in the ashes of his enemies, she would be safe. She was utterly reliant on him, utterly claimed, and in this chilling, profound moment of betrayal, her trust in his formidable protection, however terrifying, became absolute. The shock of Thomas's betrayal, coupled with Dante's swift, merciless dismissal of his own cousin, left Olivia reeling. The polished office, only moments ago a place of fragile hope, now felt tainted, a chilling testament to the ruthless undercurrents of Dante's world. Her mind raced, grappling with the cold calculation of the hidden clause in her contract. The revelation that her debts had been purchased long before she ever sat in Dante's intimidating office. It was too much. She needed answers, raw and unfiltered, even if the truth shattered the last vestiges of her peace. Dante had merely watched Thomas leave, his dark eyes like chips of granite, before turning his full, formidable attention back to Olivia. His presence in the now silent office was overwhelming, a gravitational pull she couldn't escape. She felt small, exposed, but also a surge of desperate defiance. "How long?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible in the vast room. She clutched her hands tightly, her nails digging into her palms. "How long have you known about my debts? About Nana's illness? How long have you been planning this?" Dante walked around the desk, stopping directly in front of her. He didn't sit, forcing her to look up at him, to meet his intense gaze. The sheer size of him, his broad shoulders and formidable height, pressed down on her, making her feel utterly insignificant, yet she refused to break eye contact. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, steady current, devoid of apology or explanation, simply stating facts with chilling precision. "I don't leave anything to chance, Olivia, especially not the stability of my life or the assets I deem essential." He paused, his eyes sweeping over her face, a possessive appraisal that left her breathless. "Your profile, your circumstances, your grandmother's medical needs, they were all thoroughly vetted months before I initiated contact, before the headhunter even called." Olivia gasped, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "So it was all a lie? The librarian position, the interview, you knew everything already?" He nodded slowly, a dark affirmation. "I knew you were drowning. I knew you were desperate. And I knew you were precisely what I needed." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a slim, leather-bound folder. He opened it, revealing a stack of documents. "These are the records. The transfer of your student loan portfolio to a subsidiary of my company. The direct funding of Eleanor Blackwood's specialized cardiac care, initiated 8 months ago. The securing of her place at Golden Shores with a bespoke care plan." He pushed the folder towards her, but Olivia couldn't bring herself to touch it. The sheer depth of his preparation, the methodical way he had orchestrated her entire life, was staggering. 8 months. He had been planning this, watching her, manipulating her circumstances, long before she even knew his name. It wasn't just a business deal, it was an obsession, years in the making. She was not just his fake wife, a temporary solution for a merger. She was a carefully chosen, meticulously ensnared anchor for his ruthless world. Her initial shock slowly morphed into a profound, terrifying realization. This wasn't a hero from her books sweeping in to save her. This was something far more potent, more dangerous. He was a monster, yes, but a monster who had meticulously built a fortress around her, not just to protect his interests, but her life, her grandmother, her future. "Why?" she whispered, the single word a plea for understanding, for something beyond cold calculation. Dante's eyes, dark and piercing, softened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a possessive intensity, a dark devotion. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a small, worn piece of plastic. It was her library card, the one she had lost months ago, the one with her old, shy photo smiling faintly. It lay nestled securely in his wallet, a silent testament to his prior knowledge, to the depth of his covert care. "Because you needed protecting, Olivia," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble that vibrated through her. "And because I found you." He placed the library card on the desk, beside the damning documents. "I don't acquire something so precious only to let it fall apart." Olivia stared at her worn library card, then at the man who had stolen it, who had systematically dismantled her life, only to rebuild it under his absolute control. The implications were terrifying, unsettling beyond anything she had imagined. But in that moment, seeing the tangible proof of his unwavering, albeit dark, protection, a profound, undeniable sense of safety settled over her. He had known her vulnerabilities, had anticipated her needs, and had acted with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for doubt. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek, a possessive touch that held her captive. "You are mine, Olivia, and no one touches what is mine. No one." His words were a dark promise, a chilling declaration that bound her to him more completely than any contract. She felt the stark power difference between them, his immense will against her profound vulnerability, and in it she found an unexpected, addictive peace. Her quiet world had been turned upside down, but in the chaos, in the absolute unwavering certainty of his control, she became his emotional anchor, trusting him completely. She was his, utterly and irrevocably claimed, and in this terrifying, absolute surrender, she found her only true sanctuary. The storm broke over Seattle with a primal fury, lashing the glass walls of Dante's corporate tower with sheets of rain and thunder that rattled the very foundations. Olivia stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, mesmerized by the elemental chaos outside. The city lights, usually a glittering tapestry, flickered and died, plunging the metropolis into an eerie, intermittent darkness. The wind howled like a banshee, and then, with a final ear-splitting crack of lightning that illuminated the churning bay in a stark, blinding flash, the power in the tower died completely. The penthouse, usually a beacon of light and controlled warmth, was swallowed by an inky blackness. A suffocating blanket of silence descended, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain and the distant muffled wail of sirens. Olivia gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, a sudden primal fear tightening its grip. The vast, opulent space, once her gilded cage, now felt like a vulnerable, exposed shell. The high-tech sanctuary, stripped of its power, was suddenly just glass and steel against the wild night. Then, a sickening thud echoed from somewhere below, followed by the distant metallic shriek of tortured metal. It was quickly muffled, but it was enough. It was the sound of intrusion, a breach. Olivia's blood ran cold. This wasn't the storm. This was them. Dante, who had been on a call in his study, appeared in the main living area, a formidable silhouette against the occasional flashes of lightning. He moved with a speed and fluidity that belied his imposing size. His presence suddenly, a primal force of alert, coiled readiness. He didn't speak, but his gaze, even in the near darkness, burned with a terrifying intensity as it swept over Olivia, assessing, protecting. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was not a suggestion, but an absolute directive, cutting through Olivia's paralyzing fear. Before she could fully process his words, a new sound, closer this time, ripped through the air, the splintering of wood, the muffled shouts of men, and then the sharp, unmistakable crack of gunfire. Chaos erupted. The penthouse, her supposed sanctuary, had become a battleground. Dante moved. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. He became a blur of lethal intent in the flashing darkness. Olivia, terrified, her body trembling uncontrollably, instinctively obeyed his earlier command, stumbling forward, drawn to his formidable presence like a moth to a dangerous flame. He reached her in 2 swift strides, his large hand gripping her arm, pulling her against his side with a force that left her breathless. "Marble column," he barked, his voice tight with a raw, savage urgency. "Now!" He propelled her towards a massive, unmoving marble column that stood like an ancient sentinel in the center of the living area. As another burst of gunfire tore through the air, he physically caged her against its cold, unyielding surface, his large body a shield, broad and unyielding against the unseen threat. Olivia felt the cold marble against her back, and then the solid, unyielding warmth of Dante's body pressed against hers, pinning her, protecting her. His arm, like an iron band, was thrown across her chest, holding her immobile, his face pressed into her hair as he scanned the inky darkness, his senses on high alert. She could hear the grunts and shouts now, closer, more distinct. the sounds of a brutal, desperate fight. Dante was not merely defending, he was unleashing something raw and terrifying. A mercenary, momentarily silhouetted by a lightning flash, lunged towards them. Dante moved with an animalistic roar, a broken whiskey bottle materializing in his hand. The sickening crack that followed was visceral, horrifying. Then, in another flash of light, Olivia saw him grappling with a second man, twisting, a struggle that ended with a final choked gasp. A glint of metal appeared in Dante's hand, a stolen gun. Her heart pounded against his back, a frantic, deafening rhythm. She was pressed so tightly against him, inhaling the scent of his skin, iron, rain, and a primal musk, that she felt every tense muscle, every subtle shift of his weight. She was utterly terrified, her mind screaming. But beneath the fear, a strange, dark comfort bloomed. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and he was fighting with a savage, absolute ferocity to keep her safe. He whispered into her ear, his voice low and ragged. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. Trust me." Olivia didn't question, didn't hesitate. Instinct took over, the deep, primal instinct to obey the dominant male, the powerful protector. She pressed herself tighter against him, yielding completely to his command, finding a strange, undeniable safety in the terrifying maelstrom he had created around them. His body was a wall, his will an impenetrable shield. The sounds of the battle raged around them, but within the cage of his arms, impressed against his formidable strength, Olivia felt a profound, albeit terrifying, sense of protection. He would burn the world for her, she knew, and in this terrifying, absolute surrender, she found her only true sanctuary. The last mercenary fell with a choked gurgle, collapsing in a heap of shattered glass and dark fabric. Dante stood over him, a primal force, his chest heaving, his broad shoulders slick with rain, and something darker. The broken whiskey bottle, still clutched in his hand, dripped crimson onto the marble floor. The stolen gun, its barrel gleaming faintly in the intermittent flashes of lightning, was tossed aside with a clang. The battle was over. The violence, raw and brutal, ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Silence descended upon the penthouse, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the relentless drumming of the storm against the glass walls and the ragged, shuddering breaths that tore from Olivia's throat. She was still pinned against the cold marble column, Dante's body a formidable cage around her, his arm an iron band across her chest. He was battered, bloodied, a cut above his eye weeping dark red, his tuxedo torn. He looked like a creature forged from the storm itself, dangerous and untamed. Yet in that moment, as the last echoes of the fight faded, he was undeniably her protector. He slowly released his grip, stepping back just enough for her to breathe, but his eyes, dark and piercing, never left her face. She felt herself tremble, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her from the inside out. The sheer brutality she had witnessed, the savage ferocity with which he had fought, was terrifying. He was a monster, yes, a force of nature unleashed, but he was her monster. He had burned the world, or at least this corner of it, to keep her safe. Then, with a soft mechanical hiss, an emergency exit door at the far end of the penthouse, previously locked and hidden, powered open. A sliver of grey light from the emergency stairwell spilled into the darkened room, a beacon of escape. It was her chance, her freedom. She could run. She could be free of the gilded cage, free of the terrifying control, free of the man who had just painted the opulent floors with blood for her. Olivia looked at the open door, then back at Dante. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his chest still heaving with exertion. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't try to stop her. He simply stood there, a formidable, bloodied colossus, giving her the choice. Her gaze swept over him, taking in the jagged cut, the torn fabric, the raw, unwavering intensity in his eyes. He had claimed her, protected her, fought for her with a primal savagery that spoke of something far deeper than a business arrangement. He had loved her in his own dark, possessive way, by making her his, by erecting an impenetrable wall around her. The safety she had found in his absolute control, the peculiar peace that had settled over her in his formidable shadow, was a potent, undeniable truth. Her heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm of terror, now began to beat with a different kind of urgency. It was a choice, yes, but was it truly a choice to run back to a life of quiet desperation, of looming debt, of a beloved grandmother's uncertain future? Or was it a choice to embrace the terrifying absolute protection of the man who saw her not as a liability, but as a treasure to be guarded with his very life? She looked at the open door again, the path to her old life. It looked cold, empty. She looked at Dante, battered and formidable, standing amidst the wreckage he had wrought for her. He was dangerous, yes, but he was her dangerous. He was a force, a power, and he had chosen her. Slowly, deliberately, Olivia shook her head. The tremble in her body subsided, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. She walked past him, her steps unwavering, towards his fallen desk. Papers were scattered, but a pen lay amidst them, miraculously intact. She picked it up, her fingers steady. Her gaze found the original leather-bound contract, still lying open from earlier, its clauses now seeming almost quaint compared to the visceral reality she had just experienced. She picked up the pen, her eyes locking with Dante's across the vast, silent room. A new contract. One signed not out of desperation, but out of a terrifying, undeniable choice. With trembling hands, yet with a resolute heart, she found a blank space at the bottom of the last page. Then, with a deep breath, Olivia Blackwood, the shy librarian, put the pen to paper. She signed her name, binding herself to him not by force, but by choice. She was his, utterly and irrevocably, his wife, his queen, forever claimed by the monster who had just fought a war for her. The storm had passed, leaving Seattle shrouded in a damp, bruised calm. Inside Dante's penthouse, the immediate wreckage had been cleared with chilling efficiency. Broken glass was gone, shattered furniture replaced, the scorched marble buffed to a pristine sheen. Yet the lingering scent of ozone and something metallic, something that spoke of raw violence, clung to the air, a phantom reminder of the night's brutal awakening. Olivia moved through the restored opulence like a ghost. Her senses heightened, every surface a silent testament to the war fought for her. She wasn't naive. The memory of Dante, a bloodied primal force fighting in the dark, physically caging her against the cold marble, was seared into her mind. She had seen the beast, and with a trembling hand she had chosen to walk into its embrace. The choice to sign that new contract, to bind herself to him, was stark and undeniable. Now, in the quiet aftermath, she had to process not just the raw violence she had witnessed, but the profound, irreversible decision she had made. The repercussions for Dante's rivals were swift, merciless, and utterly absolute. Olivia heard whispers from the staff, saw the grim satisfaction in Dante's eyes as he watched financial news broadcasts. Empires that had once seemed impregnable crumbled under his ruthless retaliation, their names disappearing from the headlines, their power dissolving into rumor and fear. He moved with the precision of a predator, leaving no loose ends, no lingering threats. The city, she realized, breathed a collective sigh of terror and respect for the man who had just demonstrated the terrifying extent of his reach. Thomas, Dante's cousin, was never seen again. Olivia didn't need to ask. A single dismissive comment from Dante's head of security, a clipped report delivered in her presence, spoke volumes. Thomas Thorne has been dealt with. All loose ends secured. Dante had merely nodded, his expression unyielding. Olivia felt a cold shudder, but no surprise. She understood. Betrayal, in Dante's world, was a terminal offense. His protection, she knew, came with a devastating cost, a price he would extract from anyone who dared threaten what was his. The profound choice she had made, the conscious act of signing herself over, was both terrifying and liberating. She was not a prisoner, not in the way she had once feared. She was a cherished consort, a fiercely guarded treasure, and her place in his world was now clear.